The question of the connection between the Xiongnu of the Chinese sources and the Huns of the European textual sources has been going on for almost about 250 years now. And yet scholars from different fields such as historians, linguists, and archaeologists have not reached any consensus on this question. This whole debate of the Han-Xiongnu connection had been started by the 18th century French historian Joseph de Guignéa, who proposed in 1756 that the ancestors of the mysterious Huns were the Xiongnu of northeastern Asia, based primarily on the similarity in sound of the names of these two people, Xiongnu and Huns. He noticed that ancient Chinese records referred to members of tribes associated with the Xiongnu by names similar to the Han, although with varying Chinese characters. In addition to this phonetic resemblance of the two names, the Xiongnu were conquered by the Eastern Han general Dou Xian, and they had to fled possibly to the north and west, while the European Huns were known to have come from the east. And so de Guignéa argued that the Huns were the Xiongnu who trekked west, because both were nomads, expert horsemen, and highly mobile peoples. De Guignéa's view was adopted and widely spread by his contemporary English historian Edward Gibbon, who published his monumental 6-volume book, History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This Xiongnu-Han equation, first proposed by de Guignéa and then popularized by Gibbon, prevailed on the whole, although challenged from time to time ever since the 18th century. Later on there were endless continuous discussions about their names and languages. The linguistic perspective has always been one of the most important angles concerning the hypothesis of the Xiongnu-Han identity. Numerous scholars have occupied themselves with the phonetic similarity of the two ethnonyms, especially after the discovery of several Sogdian letters in 1970, in which the Xiongnu people were written as Zhuan. With the evidence from these ancient documents, some linguists began to believe that the Xiongnu and the Huns were one and the same people. According to the narrative of de Guignéa, the history of the Xiongnu in the Far East was that of the ancient Huns, and in most cases he directly referred to the Xiongnu as Huns when describing events related to the Xiongnu. What de Guignéa meant by the name Hun, for the people usually known by the Chinese as the Xiongnu, has been interpreted in various ways later by others. Julius Heinrich Klaproth in 1826 thought that it was the simple resemblance of the name that led de Guignéa to conclude that these Xiongnu were the Huns. Wright emphasizes that de Guignéa was writing a political history and was not concerned with relating the Huns to the Xiongnu in cultural, racial, or linguistic terms. According to him, de Guignéa would have presented Xiongnu as type of Huns, even if they had all perished, as long as the Xiongnu political organization was preserved. Another important person in the discussion, Etienne de la Vaisière, believes that it was because the Xiongnu and the Huns had similar lifestyles that de Guignéa used the same name to refer to them both. Lavaisière refers to a passage in Wei Shu and suggests that the remains of the descendants of the Xiongnu were located far northwest of the Rouran. Another passage from Tongdian mentions one group of Huns arriving in Central Asia from the Altai after the year 360 CE, and therefore he suggests that the Xiongnu groups had remained in the Altai area, and from there they invaded Central Asia and Europe in the middle of the 4th century. To support his purely textual-based theory, he points to the metal cauldrons as key archaeological evidence that shows a clear link to Inner Asia, and he further supports his narrative with an event of climate change. Another notable person, Mention Helfin, noted critically that the only aspect de Guignéa cared for in his argument was the political one. The Huns were Xiongnu, if at one time they had formed part of the Xiongnu Empire. Whether they spoke the same language as the Xiongnu, had the same customs, or were of the same race, was not a matter of concern. De Guignéa was only and exclusively interested in the genealogy of political entities. The identity of the Xiongnu and the Huns, according to Mention Helfin, is far more than a political problem. In order to prove that the two groups were one and the same people, the linguistic, ethnic, and archaeological aspects of the question are to be considered. And so we will go through each of these fields and try to simplify where do we stand on each field regarding the Han-Xiongnu connection. But before we move forward, we need to understand one more very important aspect in this discussion, and that is literature. If they had their own written records, this probably would have solved this debate for the most part. But unfortunately, they were nomads, and they didn't. Because they did not keep their own records, records of their events were primarily kept in their neighboring countries, Han China for the Xiongnu, and the Roman Empire for the Huns. With respect to the Xiongnu, the most influential authors are Sima Qian, Ban Gu, and Fan Yi. When it comes to the Huns, historians such as Marcellinus, Priscus, and Jordanes kept critical accounts. To study this subject well, one must make good use of both Chinese and Western sources. These accounts are the primary sources of this topic, but they should be used with caution because the chroniclers of both China and Rome tend to indulge their biases against these wandering barbarians, such as when describing their hideous physical appearances, their primitive lifestyles, and modes of production. Despite these biases, the written sources are critical for providing basic knowledge of the two groups. Throughout the 19th and first half of the 20th century, the Xiongnu Han identity was supported mainly by a linguistic basis, which was started by Joseph de Guinea. But neither supporters nor critics of de Guinea could convince each other. This discussion reflourished again after the discovery of the ancient Sogdian letters in the early 20th century. Many scholars busied themselves trying to establish the connection between the Xiongnu and the Huns through the intermediary Zhuan in the Sogdian letters, while other experts attacked this evidence as phonetically unsound. Regarding what languages the Xiongnu spoke, three theories have prevailed. Those are Altaic, Iranic, and Yeniseic languages, with the Altaic, specifically Turkish, being the most prevalent. The language of the Huns is in even more dispute, with Altaic, Yeniseic, Indo-European, or Finno-Ugric, and scholars have failed to reach any consensus. In summary, the fragmentary nature of the evidence prevents us from determining the languages of the two groups. But another thing that needs to be brought to light, which was pointed out by Menschenhelfen, is that even if we were to establish the linguistic links between these two people, we still could not be sure that they were related. This is because the term identity meant by historians is quite different from that which the linguists mean. In the eyes of historians, it is not necessarily true that people who speak the same language are members of the same ethnic group. Archaeology was brought into this discussion in the 1940s by historians who used material culture as evidence. In the 1990s, it was further advanced by involving the archaeological analysis of the artifacts. This time, the distribution of metal cauldrons was pointed out to show a gradual migration of Xiongnu groups to the west. Archaeologists have been looking at the material culture associated with the European Huns for decades. They mostly have been looking at specific types of cauldrons, diadems, the raptor motif, and other elements which belong to the elite culture. The distribution map produced of these elements shows that these objects occurred in southeastern Europe and the Black Sea area, of which only some are traceable to the Tian Shan area and Lake Balkhash, but not to the inner Asian region further east where Xiongnu groups were located. Again, the scholars came at it from the opposite direction. They tried to identify the characteristic Xiongnu elements in the material culture of Inner and Central Asia and follow it to the European Huns. But they failed due to the paucity of archaeological material in Central Asia, mainly Kazakhstan. From an archaeological point of view, cauldrons are often seen as central to the discussion of the relationship between the Xiongnu and the Huns. Metal cauldrons are a category of objects known from roughly the 6th century BC to the 5th century CE in the Eurasian steppes. In graves of the Xiongnu period in Mongolia, a variety of different cauldrons were being used. In the archaeology of European Huns, we see two variants of large cylindrical cauldrons found between southeastern Europe and the Ural Mountains. But many have pointed out the problem with cauldrons, and that is that it was not used in the same way among both of these peoples. Cauldrons were generally used as a part of the grave inventory all over Inner Asia, while European cauldrons were mostly deposited close to the rivers, and only in rare cases they have been found to be used as funeral offerings, but not as grave inventory. And here is the thing again, can a single archaeological object be considered as a marker of a group? Many scholars think not. In summary, There is thus far no confirmed archaeological evidence that definitively establishes connections between the two peoples. Regarding their ethnicity, many scholars have accepted a hypothesis that both the Xiongnu and the Huns were heterogeneous groups. According to the existing skeletal studies, it has been shown that the mainstream theory on the ethnic origin of the Xiongnu is Asian ancestry, either as a mixture of East and North Asian peoples, or as an ancient Siberian group, with northern Xiongnu tending to have mixed with European ancestry. The Huns, for their part, were likely an admixture of both European and Asian origin, but no conclusive evidence has been found to prove that the two peoples were one and the same. Genetic studies have shown us the same result, demonstrating nothing more than that both groups were multi-ethnic in their origin. Neither anthropological studies nor genetic analysis has succeeded in providing a final conclusion. And this is because of certain challenges, for example, the minimal sample size and uncertainty in who the owners of burial sites were. As pointed out by Sinor, none of the tombs found can be attributed to the Huns with certainty. Overall, the existing scholarship has contributed to the fact that both the Xiongnu and the Huns were racially diverse. Again, even if the two groups were proven to be physically and genetically identical, language and blood did not matter in the step. Instead, it was political and cultural identity that counted the most. The Hunnic regime is described by their contemporary Priscus as a composite of different peoples speaking Hunnic, Gothic, and Latin, in which skilled warriors of various origins could rise rapidly within the regime's hierarchy. It is thus very unlikely that the European Huns were just a Xiongnu group that had marched west. What is more likely is that they were a steadily growing host of steppe warriors of different origins. We should think of the Huns as a social conglomerate rather than a monolithic group. Despite major advances in research, the source material that might connect the Xiongnu and the Huns provides little definite information. There is the linguistic link of a name, there is little information from the historical record, there is a low density of archaeological data across the Eurasian steppes from the 2nd to the 4th centuries, and what there is shows no link. We know only that some groups labeled as the Huns came from somewhere east of the Volga. So for now, no certain connections between the Xiongnu and the Huns are known, let alone continual political allegiance. This is because no reliable records ever mentioned where the northern Xiongnu went or where the Huns came from, and there are a few centuries in between that are unaccounted for. So, it is possible that the northern Xiongnu indeed trekked west, but they evidently changed their ethnicity by intermixing with other groups in the course of their migrations. And when they reached the Volga in the 370s, the question that needs to be asked is, were they still the original ethnic group of northern Xiongnu? And did they continue thinking of themselves as the Xiongnu? I think the answer to this question can still be debated. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.